James didn't like me. After we got married, he humiliated me in every possible way. I understood. After all, we were forced into this marriage, the one he loved is his first love. Seeing that James bore a resemblance to him, I was willing to tolerate it to some extent. But it was just a transaction. How could anyone take it seriously? And what I didn't expect was that the person I cherished like a treasure was discarded by others like trash. Chapter 1. When I opened the private room door, the overwhelming smell of smoke made me nauseous. Covering my nose and mouth with one hand, I looked at the familiar figure indulging himself inside. A young girl in revealing clothes was sitting on James's lap, a half-smoked cigarette between his fingers. "What are you doing here?" His eyes were full of disgust, and his tone was impatient. I was long used to everything in front of me and looked at him calmly. "Your parents want you to come with me for dinner tomorrow." James was annoyed by my gaze lingering on his face. "Got it." Having received his answer, I turned to leave. The girl on his lap with her arms around his neck spoke up. "Miss Smith, won't you stay for a drink?" I turned back to look at her. The young, pretty girl with heavy makeup was looking at me provocatively. I stared at her calmly until she became uneasy, then slowly said, "Since you know my last name is Smith, you should not waste my time." James's attitude towards me was indeed terrible, but I was not only the daughter-in-law of the Johnson family but also the only daughter of the Smith family. I didn't need to earn more dignity from James, the Smith family was my backing. Otherwise, why would James's parents force his first love away and make him marry me? Because of this, James resented me deeply and seized every opportunity to humiliate me. On our wedding night, he was caught fooling around with his lover, making it known to everyone. I wasn't angry, because the Johnson family paid a 3% share as compensation. James's anger was just that anger. Besides, seeing that he resembled the one suddenly disappeared from my life, I was willing to tolerate him to some extent. Chapter 2. When James arrived, I was still in the office handling some affairs. He casually sat on the guest sofa, sarcastically saying, "Miss Smith, you sure are busy. Have a seat. I'll be done soon." I ignored his words, knowing he only spoke nonsense. After greeted him, I continued reading the documents. After confirming some unclear details with my secretary, I finally stood up from my chair. "Let's go." James was unusually quiet today, sitting for 2 hours without making a sound, just staring at me with a strange look. Despite our well-known bad relationship, we had to maintain a facade of mutual respect in front of our parents. After dinner, the four of us sat on the sofa, chatting. James lounged lazily on the sofa while I sat upright, listening to his parents. Mr. Johnson, always stern, spoke in a commanding tone. "Emily, try to persuade your parents about the dock project in W City. We're all family, it doesn't matter who handles it." Mrs. Johnson, as usual, spoke earnestly. "Emily, you've been married to James for so long. Why haven't you gotten pregnant yet?" I smiled without speaking, so she continued. "Emily, you need to try harder. James may be immature, but you should know better. We're getting old and just want a grandchild." I kept smiling without speaking but nodded. A child would be difficult to have. Leaving the Johnson mansion, James looked at me with a mocking expression. "Emily Smith, you're quite an actress. Is this how you fooled my parents?" I remained expressionless, responding, "If you have nothing else, I'll be leaving." Two people who loathed each other naturally lived separately. As for the newlywed villa, James had never been there, and I had only stayed one night. After waiting a few seconds without a response from James, I drove away directly. No one expected that Sarah would suddenly return from abroad. What's more coincidental? I ran into James holding Sarah's hand at an auction. Chapter 3. The beautiful woman had a slender figure but wore a very plain long dress, looking both pure and charming. No wonder James had been drinking every night for the past 2 years because of her. However, James didn't look as happy as I expected. He was initially flustered but then placed his hand on Sarah's arm, looking at me with blatant provocation. You must be James's wife, Miss Smith. Nice to meet you, Sarah said gracefully. She seemed gentle and kind, appearing to be friendly towards me. But if she truly had no ulterior motives, why would she call me Miss Smith, knowing I was James's wife? It seemed that James wasn't the only one who couldn't forget old times. Miss Brown, I've heard a lot about you. Nice to meet to you too. I smiled elegantly in return. Sarah looked surprised, then glanced at James with embarrassment. James often talks about me to Mrs. Johnson? I looked at her with interest and nodded. James glanced around and then said, All right, the auction is about to start. Sarah, let's go take a seat. The auction staff had originally arranged for me and James to sit together, but now Sarah took my seat. Sarah made a move to stand up but was pulled back by James. She could only look at me apologetically. Miss Smith, I'm sorry, James. Before she could finish, James interrupted. Sarah, you don't need to apologize to her. You did nothing wrong. This was supposed to be your seat. There seemed to be a deeper meaning in James's words. He stared at me while he was talking, as if expecting me to lose my composure and get angry, but I remained calm and simply had the embarrassed staff arrange another seat for me. Chapter 4. Emily Smith, how dare you fire Sarah? James stormed in angrily. My secretary, discussing project matters with me, looked at me for help. I signaled her to leave, and she quickly walked out, closing the door behind her. Then I looked at James. Because she applied to Smith Corp. James was taken aback but still furious. Hey Emph! You just can't stand seeing Sarah doing well. I'll make sure she works by my side. Just wait. He stormed out before I could respond, slamming the door loudly. I watched his retreating figure with a meaningful gaze, finding his anger amusing. After working for 3 months to secure the W City Dock project for Mr. Johnson, he was delighted and praised James for his great progress. Leaving the Johnson mansion, James kept looking at me thoughtfully. Before I could ask, he suddenly said, Emily Smith, you like me, right? Amazing. I didn't respond, unsure how he came to that conclusion. James, however, seemed more convinced by my silence, maliciously saying, Emily Smith, are you that desperate? Knowing I love Sarah, but still try to please me? I didn't know where James got his confidence from. Perhaps it was his handsome appearance. But he was lost in his world, and I had no words for him. Honestly, I didn't care about Sarah, even though she made James act crazy around me more often. But she shouldn't have, for the sake of acting, torn the only photo of him in my wallet. Chapter 5. Slap! Slap! I snatched the torn photo from Sarah's hand and slapped her hard twice. James couldn't stop me and shouted, Emily Smith, are you crazy? He pulled Sarah over to check her face, which bore my handprints, both distressed and angry. Sarah cried softly. I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson. I didn't mean to. I just accidentally picked up this wallet and wanted to see whose it was. I didn't know it was yours. James quickly comforted her. It's okay, Sarah. It's just an old wallet. But I accidentally tore the photo Mrs. Johnson had in her wallet. That man must be important to her, right? Sarah looked uneasy, but James couldn't comfort her. What did you say? What man? Sarah, seemingly unaware of the changing atmosphere, innocently said, The man on Mrs. Johnson's phone lock screen. Rather than a man, he was a boy. The boy had an exceptionally handsome face, smiling at the camera, his lips curved in a helpless yet sweet smile. More striking than his blue-dyed hair was the wheelchair he sat in. Who is he? James held my dropped phone, demanding. Ignoring him, I put the torn photo back in my wallet, then stepped forward, grabbed Sarah's long black hair and slapped her twice more. Before she could cry out, I whispered coldly in her ear. Why provoke me? Do you think I don't know why you went abroad? Sarah's head was pulled back painfully, and she cried out, but upon hearing my words, she closed her mouth in fear. Because she couldn't let James know she went abroad, not because of heartbreak but because she took a large sum of money from Mrs. Johnson. And she couldn't let James know she followed Ethan abroad. Chapter 6. Ethan was the boy in the photo. He was my college classmate, exceptionally handsome, with eyes that seemed to always hold affection, a high and straight nose, and a slightly pale complexion that added a touch of melancholy, making him even more attractive. On the day of enrollment, he drew the attention of the entire school. James and Sarah were 3 years younger than me. By the time they enrolled, Ethan had gotten used to wearing a mask daily and was no longer the center of attention. James didn't know this, but Sarah fell in love with Ethan after seeing his true face once. At that time, Ethan was still mine, and she dared to send him love letters and flirt with him. Ethan didn't care, but I remembered. Ethan and I dated for 4 years. He didn't talk much but always smiled at me, making my heart melt. When we graduated, I had even prepared a ring to propose, but Ethan left a breakup letter and disappeared. I searched everywhere but only found out he had gone abroad. He never mentioned going abroad. Ethan's letter clearly stated that my unstable emotions during our relationship made him tired, and he didn't want any more entanglements. I knew if I saw him, I wouldn't let him go. So, I decided not to see him. I also knew that Sarah, after taking money from Mrs. Johnson, followed Ethan abroad. Since we had broken up, I had no right to interfere with Ethan's love life. I agreed to my family's arranged marriage. Since it wasn't Ethan, it didn't matter who it was. Chapter 7. Emily Smith, are you crazy? Perhaps because he had never seen me lose my temper in 2 years of marriage, James was stunned, both angry and shocked. I ignored him, calming down as I let go of Sarah's hair and turned to leave. But the torn photo seemed to unlock something, and Ethan's presence in my life suddenly became stronger. At a college reunion, I unexpectedly heard news about him. Hey, did you know Ethan is back? How do you know? My wife works at the airport and saw him a few days ago. Does your wife know Ethan? Not really. But she saw my graduation photo with Ethan in it. Anyone who has seen Ethan would remember him, right? The gossip stopped abruptly when they noticed me, and they smiled awkwardly. The reunion was boring, so I left early after a couple of drinks. I still couldn't help wanting to know about Ethan. Ethan was back. But I didn't expect to see him at my apartment building when I returned from the reunion. Chapter 8. I stood still, watching the delighted young man walk towards me, calling me Emily in a familiar voice and tone. I snapped back to reality. 2 years apart, the beautiful and handsome young man looked even better. His eyes were full of longing but also a hint of unease. Why are you here? I asked coldly, as if the person I had been thinking about day and night wasn't standing in front of me. Ethan was stunned. I had never spoken to him so coldly. I came back to find you, Ethan said, looking lost. He lowered his head slightly, like a child who had done something wrong. Really? Is my place a hotel? You come and go as you please? My voice was low but sharp. I'm sorry, Emily. Ethan kept apologizing. I couldn't help but interrupt him. Is that all you can say? Ethan fell silent. He was never good with words, and it seemed he hadn't improved in that regard over the past 2 years. Ethan looked at me quietly for a while, then suddenly said, Emily, I missed you so much. The intense love in his words almost made me lose my composure. Emily Smith, what are you doing? A man's angry voice came from a distance. Chapter 9. I quickly lowered my hand, which was about to reach out, and looked calmly at the approaching James. James looked like a husband catching his wife cheating, full of righteous indignation, which was laughable. Emily Smith, I'm talking to you. Who is he? James pointed at Ethan. I frowned. James, spoiled by his family, was indeed rude. Unlike James's disgust, Ethan's first look at James was one of feigned indifference but filled with jealousy. I was moved. Even someone as gentle as Ethan could feel jealousy. Seeing I still didn't speak, James looked carefully at Ethan and suddenly realized. He's the one in the photo? He turned to Ethan. But weren't you disabled? How are you standing? Were you faking it? James's words were more malicious than questioning. But he voiced my biggest question of the night, and I looked at Ethan's long, straight legs. I had wanted to ask the moment I saw him, but I held back, not wanting to show I cared. I went abroad for treatment. Ethan answered James but looked at me, clearly speaking to me. Hearing this, I couldn't help but get angry. Really? You had to break up with me to get treatment? The doctor said the success rate was only 1%. My injury was too old. Ethan's eyes were full of longing, love, and unease, but no regret. This meant he didn't regret his actions. Surgery always carried risks, especially with such a low success rate. Not to mention, even if successful, the rehabilitation would be arduous and painful. The more I thought about it, the more heartbroken and angry I became. When did I ever complain about your legs? I couldn't even say the word. Dislike. I had sought many renowned doctors for Ethan, but all had given disappointing results. Ethan had given up after repeated failures, but suddenly, he was determined to get treatment. My intuition told me it had something to do with me. When I first met Ethan, he was already in a wheelchair. On his first day at school, I helped him with his luggage. The handsome boy smiled shyly, his soft voice like a summer breeze, refreshing and pleasant. Despite his disability and lack of background, Ethan was talented and hardworking, never feeling inferior. He had a strong talent for computers, taking on online jobs to play games and write systems for others. But the orphanage environment limited his development. It wasn't until he went to college that he truly thrived. I bought him his first professional computer, but he transferred all the money he earned to my account. I had never lacked money, but I knew how much someone was willing to spend on you often reflected their level of care. I fell for Ethan at first sight and pursued him actively. But I was used to prioritizing my interests and couldn't sustain long-term, unreciprocated efforts. Ethan fell for me later, but his love was purer and more intense. Ethan lived simply, but he always matched or exceeded my standards for gifts. For example, I wouldn't spend millions on a limited edition watch for daily use, but he would buy one for an anniversary gift. He never complained about his hardships but listened attentively to my troubles and tried to make me happy. Physical attraction is natural, but personality and values determine the longevity of a relationship. The closer I got to Ethan, the more I loved him. Over time, Ethan sometimes felt down about his disability. But I never saw his legs as a regret. I knew his injury was from a car accident, not congenital. Such an event was most devastating for the person involved, but Ethan recovered quickly, making me both heartbroken and more appreciative of him. But I never knew Ethan cared so much about his legs. I know you wouldn't mind, but I mind. Emily, you're too dazzling. I want to stand with you. Ethan lowered his head, speaking softly. Ethan, how can I stay mad at you? I sighed, feeling deflated. No, you should be mad. I shouldn't have left you for so long. Ethan's voice was filled with longing and tenderness. I looked at the now mature young man before me, taller than my 5'7" frame. I started to speak but was interrupted by James's angry voice. Emily Smith, did you hear me? Who is he? Ethan finally glanced at James. Hello, I'm Emily's. He started with a smile but hesitated, looking at me with his beautiful eyes, then lowered his head in disappointment. My heart broke. I gently said to Ethan, "It's late. You should go rest. We'll talk tomorrow. My number hasn't changed. I'll come find you." Ethan nodded, looking at me with longing and reluctance but left as I asked. Seeing James about to explode, I coldly said, "He's Ethan, my ex-boyfriend. Do you have something to say? I'm your husband. What, can't I come to see you? Emily Smith, you better remember your status and not do anything unworthy of being Mrs. Johnson. Or else, don't blame me for being rude." James warned menacingly. I looked at him expressionlessly. Husband? Disgusting. Do you have anything else? James's expression turned strange, and he stammered. Sarah said that guy looks a bit like me, Emily Smith. Did you use me as a substitute? No. I replied indifferently. No one could replace Ethan. James's resemblance to him was just a reminder of what I had lost. James seemed unsure but had to accept it. It better be that way. He thought for a moment and suddenly said, Emily Smith, I just realized we've never shared a bed since we got married. How about I stay over tonight? I looked at him coldly. He looked uneasy, his eyes shifting, but he didn't back down. Just then, his phone rang. Sarah, what? Don't be afraid, I'm coming. He hung up and said, Never mind, maybe next time. I have something to do. He quickly left. I watched his retreating figure. The trap was set, and it was time for me to leave. I had planned to visit Ethan the next afternoon after work, but he told me he was at the Stede Francis Hotel, room 211. So I drove over. Just as I was about to enter the room, I heard a familiar female voice inside. Ethan, you shouldn't have come back. I stopped. Why was James's mother here? Chapter 10. Ethan, my return has nothing to do with you. Ethan said calmly. I know, Ethan, you're still angry with James, but he was just a child back then. It was an accident, he didn't mean to hurt you. Mrs. Johnson's voice held a hint of apology but was mostly filled with disapproval of Ethan's actions. Ethan's voice remained steady. Whether I'm angry or not, the Johnson family made sure I wouldn't be. I knew it, Ethan, you're still holding a grudge against us. Mrs. Johnson seemed a bit hurt. Ethan didn't want to engage further. Mrs. Johnson, if you have something to say, please get to the point. There was a moment of silence before Mrs. Johnson spoke again. Ethan, you should go back abroad and let Emily and James live their lives. If that's all you have to say, then I'm afraid I can't oblige. Ethan replied, the sound of a chair scraping the floor indicating he was about to leave. Ethan, why can't you be as obedient as you were 2 years ago? You must understand, Emily is the only daughter of the Smith family. Even if you're no longer disabled, you're still not a match for her. She's happy with James now. Why come back and ruin everything? Mrs. Johnson's voice was a mix of pleading, urgency, confusion, and mostly anger. Ethan didn't respond immediately. His footsteps stopped at the door. Mrs. Johnson, why do you always think only of James? After all, I'm your biological son, aren't I? The room fell into a heavy silence. The next moment, Ethan pushed the door open to leave but stopped when he saw me standing there. The sarcasm in his eyes turned to joy. Emily. His eyes still held traces of sadness, but his face lit up with a smile. Inside, Mrs. Johnson stood up abruptly, looking at me with panic. Emily, what are you doing here? Before I could answer, she quickly walked to the door, glaring at Ethan. Did you call Emily here? Did you do this on purpose? Ethan's smile faded. Mrs. Johnson, you must be joking. You were the one who asked me to come here today. Don't lie, Ethan. Mrs. Johnson's aggressive stance suggested she had more to say, but I interrupted. Mother, I have something to discuss with Ethan. We'll be leaving now. With that, I took Ethan's hand and walked away. Emily, wait. Mrs. Johnson called out in a mix of anger and panic behind us. Chapter 11. Outside the hotel, I was about to let go of Ethan's hand, but he held on tightly. I turned to look at him. His expression was anxious, his beautiful eyes filled with a hint of sadness. Emily, aren't you going to ask me? Ethan looked at me puzzled. I paused for a moment then asked. Was it James who hurt you? Ethan nodded. Yes, when I was in my second year of high school. I looked at him, signaling him to continue. That car accident revealed that James wasn't their biological son, but I was. However, They said they had deeper feelings for James and didn't want to acknowledge me. They offered me money to not pursue the matter. Hospital treatments were expensive, and I had no money at the time, so I agreed not to hold James responsible. Ethan's tone was calm, as if recounting someone else's story, hiding the pain, despair, and resentment he must have felt. He looked at me and even smiled a bit, with a hint of sarcasm. Before they left, they warned me not to tell James he wasn't their biological son. I hugged the young man who was trying to hide his sadness and gently patted his back. Ethan, don't think about it anymore. Ethan buried his face in my shoulder, responding with a muffled, "Okay." I stroked his head. The Johnsons' claim of deeper feelings was laughable, only meant to deceive someone as innocent as Ethan. They simply looked down on Ethan for growing up in an orphanage, lacking elite education, and being disabled from the accident, thinking he was inferior to James. The Johnsons were indeed powerful, using their influence to bully others. How dare they discard someone I cherished like trash? Such a high and mighty family, just taking a piece of their flesh wouldn't be enough. It would be better to make an example of them. Chapter 12. Ethan, I don't have anywhere to go. Can I stay with you for a while? Please? I knew Ethan was lying. He wouldn't be without a place to stay. But with his beautiful eyes looking at me so pleadingly, I couldn't refuse. Ethan eventually moved into my apartment, but I didn't expect James to show up suddenly. The doorbell rang while I was watching a movie on the couch. Ethan, having just finished his shower, went to open the door out of habit. "What are you doing here?" James's shocked and furious voice echoed from the doorway. He practically stormed in. "Emily, you're actually keeping a lover behind my back?" His accusation made it clear that Sarah was behind this. That woman, always eyeing Ethan, couldn't change her ways. I remained on the couch, not even bothering to get up, calmly greeting him. "James, you're just in time. I was about to tell you, let's get a divorce." I pulled out a stack of photos from under the table and threw them on top. I always knew Sarah was smart, keeping James hooked while secretly pursuing Ethan. Such a capable person deserved a little help. I had someone get James drunk and then notified Sarah. With mutual feelings and the catalyst of alcohol, things naturally happened. James bent down to pick up the photos, flipping through them. Seeing the explicit images, he became furious. "Emily, you had me investigated?" I scoffed, finding his anger amusing. James, seeing my silence, grew angrier. "Emily, you can forget about a divorce. I know you just want to be with your lover. Well, I won't let you. I will never divorce you." Unfazed by his anger, I shrugged. "If that's what you think, there's nothing I can do." "You..." James was at a loss for words. He turned his anger towards Ethan. "You seduced a married woman. Don't you feel ashamed?" Ethan didn't respond, biting his lip and looking at me for help with his beautiful eyes. I stood up abruptly. "What does this have to do with Ethan? James, you better sign the divorce papers while I'm being nice, or don't blame me for being rude." "Nice? You call this nice? Emily, you and your lover can dream on. I will never agree to a divorce." "Fine." I sat back down on the couch. "Then you can leave now. Or I'll call security." James, not wanting to make a scene, glared at me and Ethan before storming out. Ethan closed the door and sat down beside me on the couch. He lay back, resting his head on my lap, looking up at me with his beautiful eyes. "How can you tolerate him treating you like this?" I stroked his smooth, fair face, smiling gently. "Don't you know me, Ethan?" Ethan said nothing, just hugged my waist and nuzzled against me. Chapter 13. Some people believed that since I was the only daughter of the Smith family, whoever married me would get the Smith Corporation. The Johnsons were no exception. Even though James and I had a prenuptial agreement, his parents still thought that if I had a son, the Smith Corporation would belong to their grandson, and thus to the Johnson family. James, like his parents, considered the Smith Corporation as his own, which is why he was so angry when I refused to let Sarah join the company. Initially, I only planned to use the marriage to get close to the Johnsons, set a trap, and take a piece of their flesh to warn others not to covet the Smith Corporation. It wasn't that I had no interest in the Johnsons, but the Smith Corporation and the Johnson Corporation were evenly matched. Trying to swallow the Johnson Corporation alone was too risky. But with Ethan, it was different. Ethan had started his own business in college, and his company, Ethan Corp., had quickly risen to prominence. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't interfere with Ethan's business, but given his unconditional obedience to me, I essentially had control over Ethan Corp. Moreover, joining forces to take down the Johnson Corporation would be a win-win for both the Smith and Ethan corporations. James refused to divorce and clung to me. So, I decided to bring down the Johnson Corporation, forcing him to agree. The W City Dock project was a trap. I worked hard to lure the Johnson Corporation into investing heavily. Blinded by the potential profits and believing the Smith Corporation was also involved, Mr. Johnson didn't suspect anything when I persuaded my father to withdraw, leaving the Johnson Corporation to take over. With their cash flow tied up and the funding chain broken, combined with other project issues, the Johnson Corporation was on the brink of collapse. The Johnson family confronted me, and I had one condition: divorce, and I'll help the Johnson Corporation withdraw from the project. Withdrawing would allow them to recover funds and possibly survive the crisis. Meanwhile, Sarah was expecting. Things were about to end. I looked out the window at the clear sky. Soon, James came to me as I had hoped. "Emily, let's get a divorce." James looked defeated, with dark circles under his eyes, unshaven and disheveled. I glanced at him and asked calmly, "Do your parents know about this?" James hesitated, then seemed to resolve himself. "I'll talk to them. Sarah is expecting, and I need to take responsibility." I checked the time. The Civil Affairs office was still open. "Shall we go now?" James nodded. Soon, we each had a green booklet in hand. A mere illegitimate child, the Johnsons wouldn't give up the Smith Corporation for him. They still harbored delusions of getting the Smith Corporation to help them through the crisis. But James, now a father-to-be, would. Faced with a struggling Johnson Corporation and his first love's pregnancy, James had no choice but to give in. But I wouldn't let a cooked duck fly away. With Ethan's help, we ultimately took over the Johnson Corporation. James blocked my way outside the Smith Corporation building. "Emily, you tricked me?" James's eyes were bloodshot, looking terrifying. I smiled. "I did help the Johnson Corporation withdraw from the project, didn't I?" The project was actually good, but the timeline was too long, nearly bankrupting the Johnson Corporation. When they withdrew, the project was halfway done, and the Smith Corporation reaped the benefits. Ethan stood beside me, always on guard. But James just stood there defeated. He finally asked softly, "Emily, did you ever like me? Even for a moment?" I found his question absurd. Of course not. I didn't understand why James was still hung up on these feelings or how he could have such a ridiculous thought. But before leaving, I rolled down the car window and told James, "You were really dedicated to the Johnson Corporation, considering you're not their biological son. It's touching." If I had told James earlier that he wasn't their biological son, he might not have compromised for the Johnson Corporation. Now that it was all over, I didn't mind revealing the truth. The Johnson family fell into chaos and eventually went bankrupt. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson couldn't accept it, struggling until even their house was repossessed by the bank. They were left with nothing. They tried to approach Ethan, but he had them thrown out. Mr. Johnson regretted deeply. A biological child is still better. We should have acknowledged Ethan from the start. Mrs. Johnson blamed Sarah for their downfall, often berating and scolding her. Sarah's child was lost in an accident, but worse, she was diagnosed with a serious illness. This meant James, who had been with her, was also at risk. In fact, Sarah had led a colorful life abroad after failing to win Ethan's heart. She had many wealthy boyfriends, but they played hard. After spending all her money, she remembered James, who loved her deeply. Didn't they look down on Ethan for his poor background? Now, I made sure the Johnsons lost their high status. Didn't they force Ethan to not pursue responsibility for the accident? Didn't they love Sarah? Now, they could be a pair of doomed lovers. At night, after my bath, I found Ethan reading in bed. Seeing me, his beautiful eyes lit up with a smile, making me smile too. The long night stretched ahead, and we had a long future together. Chapter 14. Ethan's perspective. I never thought my disability was a major obstacle until I was with Emily. The first time I saw her, I felt a flutter in my heart. Her proactive approach made me ecstatic. But Emily was too outstanding, too dazzling. I didn't want people to gossip about her having a disabled partner. I didn't want to never be able to hold her. I wanted to be worthy of her, to stand proudly by her side. So, I took a gamble and went abroad for surgery. I didn't want to break up with Emily, but I feared the surgery might fail and didn't want her to worry constantly. Fortunately, the surgery was successful. My legs recovered well after rehabilitation. I couldn't wait to return and find Emily. I knew she was married, and seeing that foolish man made me uncontrollably jealous. But I knew Emily couldn't possibly like him. Emily was possessive and hated anyone who insulted her. She wouldn't allow anyone to covet her private property, the Smith Corporation. I didn't want to acknowledge those unfortunate parents, but Emily felt sorry for me. She brought down the Johnson Corporation for me, unwilling to let me stay with her without a proper status, forcing that fool to divorce her. She really loves me. I want to be with Emily forever. Chapter 15. James's perspective. At first, I hated Emily. Because of our arranged marriage, my mother forced Sarah away. In 2 years of marriage, Emily always maintained a calm and composed demeanor. I hated it, constantly provoking her, trying to get her attention, hoping to make her lose control. But Emily always remained unfazed, showing no emotion. Until that man Ethan appeared. Sarah tore that photo, and that was the first time I heard of Ethan. Just a damaged photo made her furious. I could easily see how much she cared about that man. Sarah mentioned in passing that I looked a bit like him, and my heart sank, thinking of the word substitute. I repeatedly observed myself in the mirror, unable to resist coming to ask her for an answer. But I didn't expect to find her with that man. I had never seen Emily like this, almost wearing her emotions on her face: heartache, anger, and reproach. Her eyes seemed to hold only that man who suddenly appeared. When Emily said she wanted a divorce, I was almost overwhelmed by anger, perhaps mixed with a bit of fear and jealousy. I didn't want a divorce, but Emily was ruthless, forcing me to give in.